Thank you so much. Can you see my screen and hear me and
Yes,
the slides? Yes?
yes, both.
Thank you. Um, it's a real honor to be before you. I want to thank the task force for their work. I want to thank my fellow panelists for sharing their moving um, remarks. Mi Mao, she was the first Hmong to be elected to a state legislative seat in the country in Minnesota in the 2000s. And she once said, every time I get up to speak, I get a lump in my throat. And my grandmother said, the lump you're feeling in your throat represent the voices of all your ancestors that have gone before you, that have no voice. And now you have voice, and you're speaking on their behalf. And that's what you feel the lump in your throat is their voices demanding you represent their life experiences, the unspoken. And so today, I have that one. I want to say that when we speak of the legacy of racism in the US and the glacial progress, the glacial pace of racial progress, um, it's really the unfinished civil rights agenda. And I want to speak specifically on the critical role of education policy. School quality is the engine of upward mobility. And yet, historically, school funding mechanisms have been implicitly tied to long-standing assumptions about which communities and students are deserving of adequate educational investment, who has the greatest capacity to learn, and which students we set high expectations for and hold to high standards versus low expectations and low standards. Now, school segregation and unequal school resources are the nerve center of inequitable educational opportunity that perpetuates structural racism. A systems based approach to inequality that considers the intersections of race and class, pre K and K 12, public education, and health investments are essential to develop the requisite policy prescriptions for sustainable, equity based reform. Now, what I want to kind of highlight here is the cycle of inequality, of unequal opportunities producing and reproducing inequality across generations. When we look at nationally representative set of children born into low income families and examine how do they fare in adulthood, we see that 42% of children in those low income families in childhood remain poor as adults, where we see a great degree of persistence in economic status across generations, particularly in the lower tail of the distribution. But it's really the racial disparities in multi generational poverty that really brings it more clearly in view. Namely, that when we look at um, adults today who are low income, as defined by being in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, we see that among African Americans, the likelihood of being an adult in the bottom fifth of the income distribution is 42%. And we see that's roughly 15% for whites. But when we look at the generational persistence of that, if you look at the probability that an adult today is in the bottom fifth being low income, and their parents were also low income, we see that a third of Black adults today fit that description. Wow, that's only 5% for whites. And finally, when we look at the probability of being poor today in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, and your parent was low income and your grandparent was low income, we see 22% of Black adults today have parents that were poor and their grandparents were poor, where we see that multi generational poverty among whites only 1%. So, what I want to highlight here is the generational link that connects the reason why the percentage of families that are Black that are in the bottom fifth of the income distribution is 42%, and yet two-thirds of families that were in the bottom fifth of the income distribution and their parents were also low income, that two-thirds of those families are Black, and that multi-generational poverty is a uniquely Black experience, meaning the persistence of that poverty And a big part of that is the role of segregation. That when you look at adults today who are on the bottom fifth of the income distribution, and their parents were on the bottom fifth, and their grandparents were low income as well, 82% of the families that fit that generational profile are African American. That is not a coincidence, but a big part of the policy environment that has connected segregation to unequal opportunity. Now, what I want to first highlight is the slow speed of the glacial speed of racial economic convergence. Since the end of the Civil War, racial economic convergence in the U.S. has proceeded at a glacial pace from 25% in the black-white income ratio in 1870 to roughly 65% today. Now, what I just want to highlight, though, to you is that period that I've circled there is the period in which we had the greatest racial economic convergence that we've witnessed, and that period is precisely the period that overlaps cohorts that were exposed to significant efforts in integration. Economic mobility from one generation to the next. That is, if Black Americans experience the same rates of generational mobility as their white counterparts, the speed of racial economic convergence would be more than twice the observed rate we see and have experienced from 1870 to 2010. In other words, racial disparities in income have declined at less than half the speed that would have been expected over the past 150 years if there weren't such a large racial difference in generational mobility, even controlling for the parents' original starting point. And this holds for the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras, as well as the recent decades. This is drawn from recent work by Bob Margo, economist Bob Margo, and Pat Bayer. And so what this means is that for the past 150 years, for generation after generation, the economic success of Black Americans have consistently severely lagged those of white Americans who began their lives in otherwise comparable economic circumstances. And so you may want to reflect here on what drives that slow speed of racial economic convergence. Well, I'm emphasizing it's not just racial discrimination in schooling and job and the labor market and professions and lending and housing and policing and criminal justice. That's all true. But in addition, it's the segregation of opportunity. The persistently high levels of segregation in schools and neighborhoods are influencing the structure of opportunity for kids and thereby thwarting upward mobility prospects for Black children in particular. That Black and white families who are identical in almost every way in terms of household income routinely reside in neighborhoods that look nothing alike in terms of the available resources. So when we talk about integration, I don't just mean the assignment of children to schools, but we're fundamentally talking about per pupil spending, teacher quality, access to AP courses. We're talking about curricular quality, teacher diversity. Those are all the pieces that what integration means when it's applied. I want to highlight that the differences in parental wealth and the racial disparities in wealth are a big part of why affluent Black households, those with incomes above $75,000, live in neighborhoods with a higher average poverty rate than poor white households, that is those with income below $40,000. This has been shown in related work by Pat Bayer and Sean Reardon et al. Okay. Now, what I want to highlight is when you look at this period of the Black-white academic achievement gap, this period where we saw the greatest racial convergence in economic outcomes, in health outcomes, in academic achievement, again, is the period of cohorts that overlapped exposure to integration. We see the kind of major slowing down of that convergence since cohorts born after 1985. And so what I just want to highlight is when we think about the connections of racial stigma and structural racism, you have to understand it from a life course perspective, that the ways in which racial stigma leads to neighborhood segregation, that feeds and fuels school persistent segregation and access to opportunity, educational resources, and then that leads to differences in college readiness and in degree attainment. And those pieces are part of what democratize access to the labor market. And those pieces then spill over to criminal justice interactions, and that, again, racial stigma around who's profiled, et cetera. And all of those pieces collectively impact the generational mobility process that leads to long-term economic standing and social status that then recycles its way through into the next generation. So what we're talking about here is these mechanisms for the slow glacial pace of progress is the housing discrimination, the racial wealth disparities, the racial differences in home ownership. Those are mechanisms, but it's really what we have to kind of understand is how these pieces lead to cascading effects across the life course. Disparities in academic achievement lead to disparities in access to higher education and labor market disparities, discrimination in criminal justice, disparities in economic status. And so we have to think about where is it that we intervene. Now, Brown v. Board and the subsequent movement for integration is what I'm going to be highlighting in part, just so that you can see that when we've had concerted, intentional efforts to disrupt the systems that reproduce racial inequality, that we've seen progress. Okay. Now, the Fair Housing Act of the late 60s from the Civil Rights Movement, integration, school funding reforms, both pre-K expansions and access, and school funding reforms that didn't rely solely on the property tax base to fund local schools. That when we've done those things, again, redesigning Section 8 housing so that concentrated poverty is not the essential reality for low-income, particularly Black households. Affirmative action, enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the job training programs, right? Sentencing reform, minimum wage laws, and kind of greater enforcement of pay discrimination, and a more robust safety net. These are all pieces that have to be connected in a system-based approach. Now, what I'm just describing first is that there's an argument that school desegregation was a failed social experiment, or that school spending doesn't matter, or that pre-K is ineffective on long-term outcomes, and it's simply not borne out by the facts. Where we failed is discontinuing those efforts to integrate our schools, to invest in them equitably, and to begin in the pre-K years. So I'm just going to try to bring us back to where some of the movement began on the eve of the Brown v. Board. Now you can see, oftentimes people think of this as a Southern phenomenon, but actually we see there is a strong regional variation in terms of legal segregation prohibited, de jure, de facto. We can see that in the South throughout legal segregation was required. But what we also understand is that the timing of actual integration efforts, that nothing happened after the first decade after Brown, that when we look at the map of when integration efforts really kicked off, that the first decade after Brown, there was little actual integration that occurred. And then we see with the 64 Civil Rights Act and putting teeth in enforcement, we see Jackson 1963 versus Pasadena. We see the Crawford 1976 case where they were grappling with how and affirmed that de jure school segregation and racially motivated school boundary gerrymandering was unconstitutional. And so it wasn't just in the South that these aggressive ways to resist integration were happening, but it was happening in California as well. And so what we show is by using the full universe of the timing of that set of integration efforts, we see that when the court orders were enforced, that we see a dramatic decrease in racial school segregation. And that led to significant increases of leveling up school resources to the level white students were previously getting, where we see children from the same districts after enforcement of school desegregation court orders, that we see about a 20% increase in per pupil spending among Black students being experienced relative to cohorts from those same schools that were previously confined to all racially segregated schools. So the dual system, what we then do is document how, when we follow those kids, these are cohorts born between 1950 and 1970. And what we see is among those cohorts that experience integration, that with each year of exposure, that Black children achieve much greater educational attainment, to the point where by the late 80s, the rates of college attendance rates for 18 and 19-year-olds, the black-white difference, the rate at which Black children were attending college had actually risen to comparable rates as in many places as white students. What we also see is that that increase in educational attainment and educational quality was mirrored in significant improvements in adult earnings. That we see about a 1 to 3% increase in earnings with each additional year of exposure. That translated into about a 30% increase in adult earnings relative to prior cohorts that had been relegated to segregated schools from those same districts. And that led to a significant reduction in the annual incidence of poverty. That significantly led to about a 20 percentage point decline in the annual likelihood of poverty being experienced in adulthood compared to Black children from those same districts prior to integration going into effect. And we don't see that these impacts led to significant reductions in attainment for white children. Now, this was connected not only to school integration, but hospital integration, desegregation that preceded it. That in the South, access to hospitals had been significantly prevented. And basically, when we look at places, this is drawn from Ken Shays et al.'s work, to show the decline in post-neonatal mortality rates, particularly in Mississippi and Alabama. And we see that led to significant improvements in infant health that then also led to significant improvements in educational and cognitive outcomes. So what I'm just trying to highlight here is that these changes, that segregation creates fertile conditions to act as a contagion, to accelerate the spread of infection of racism, and no U.S. institution has gone untouched. But what we have done is ceased our efforts to integrate our schools. The inequalities baked into the system, the schools, the housing, the school funding, the public pre-K, the safety net, health policies, it's all connected. And so what we need in the policy debate is a systematic approach to segregation and discrimination that ties education to housing, pre-K and health, and other policy areas. And so in the contemporary policy influences on school segregation, the reason why we are currently at levels of segregation today that prevailed in the early to mid 90s, in the early to mid 70s, that is, we've resegregated. We reached peak integration levels in the late 80s, 1988 to be exact. And in each year since, we have begun to revert back to now the same levels that prevailed in the early 70s. And part of that is school closings and unregulated charter school growth and gerrymandered school district boundaries and a kind of federal hands-off policy around integration. We see racialized tracking, right, where the AP course and college preparatory course access is very different. Even a third of our public high schools that have a large Hispanic and Black enrollment, a third of them do not offer calculus, which is one of the gateway courses to STEM fields and being able to major in engineering and some of those STEM majors in college. We see housing policies around zoning policies, as Stephen was mentioning, the provision of government services in terms of how we design our housing subsidies and our housing programs that often confine lower income families to concentrated poverty neighborhoods. And then the real estate practices and mortgage lending discrimination that is coupled with it. And this is all layered onto the legacy of the restrictive covenants, the segregated housing projects. Now, when Stephen was describing the restrictive covenants, I grew up in the Minneapolis metropolitan area. And when my parents first bought their first home in a small suburb right outside of Minneapolis, they had still on the title deed the restrictive covenants that said this house is not to be sold to Negroes or Jews. And they saved that just for the safekeeping of recognizing this history in a generational sense is not far away, but its consequences are still being felt today. When we look at desegregated schools, the cosmetic appearance of them, we have to think about whether they're functioning in integrated fashion. That too often, even when we see what looks like diverse schools, that there's segregated classrooms within what otherwise ostensibly may look like diverse schools. So we have to think about how are we tracking students and having high expectations beginning in the early years so that there's not that kind of segregation. Now, what I want to highlight briefly, because I know I'm kind of running short on time, what I want to just highlight briefly is that what Pat Bayer, for example, has been able to document, as well as Sean Reardon, is that a significant part of this part of parental wealth differences, that when we look at the average neighborhood resourced environment that dictates access to school resources, et cetera, that the typical affluent Black household is in a less advantaged neighborhood in terms of resources than low income white neighborhoods. Sorry, low income white households. So if you look at Black and white households with the same parental income, that oftentimes the typical Black household, while having that same income, is in a much less resourced school environment. And what that means is that these prevailing high levels of segregation, they undermine equal educational opportunity. They're the single biggest driver of racial differences in upward mobility prospects for children. They make the nation less productive and competitive, and they weaken our economy. And so what we want to really do is think about how we can restructure these pieces. That while residential segregation patterns are by race and class are often viewed as the harmless byproduct of personal choices, or like simply the result of market forces, the causes and consequences of segregation are a direct byproduct of policy choices. Segregation has long been policy engineered. And so what we have to recognize is desegregation to integration means moving from access to inclusion. It's moving from exposure to understanding. And really, this is the way forward. And we have to recognize that putting billions of dollars into racially segregated and unequal structures can be counterproductive and can just be a recipe for inefficiency, not innovation. Housing and credit markets, education and schools, transportation and job creation schemes like opportunity zones, we need to think about creating opportunity in ways that recognize how segregation and its forces can undermine the true realization of equal opportunity for kids. And for every $100 of wealth held by white families, the average Black households hold up only $5. A quarter of Black families have no or negative net worth, compared with less than 10% of white families. And too often the study of inequality is ahistorical and falls victim to the policy amnesia about the long-run conditions that produce the current realities, the current disparities. Racial wealth disparities are not primarily driven by differences in individuals' savings behaviors, but instead are a legacy of segregative and discriminatory housing policies. This point is best highlighted by the fact that the typical Black American with a college degree has less wealth than the average non-college educated white American. The consequences of the concentration of wealth and affluence on the one hand, and the concentration of poverty on the other, that profoundly impact children's access to opportunity, may imperil our collective future. Too often, we have opportunity-rich communities where children thrive in well-funded, highly resourced schools that are geographically close, but socioeconomically worlds apart from the concentrated poverty schools within the same metropolitan area. It's become far too common to find a school-to-prison pipeline near a school-to-life success one in a neighboring district. These patterns begin early in children's lives, but our policy responses to them have occurred very late. So I want to stop here. I want to emphasize that I've tried to highlight the ways in which differential access to school quality and neighborhood conditions explain the lion's share of racial differences in rates of upward mobility across children from low-income families. And we need policy responses that focus on the educational opportunity of children that are not dictated by zip code, race, skin color, and poverty. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to the question and answer with the task force, as well as other questions that may arise. There's many more things to say, but I want to thank you for your time.